In recent years, we've seen how deeply political history is. If you look at the moment at what's going on around the national curriculum, what is to be taught in the schools, you can see the extent to which it has become politicised. The fate of the Indigenous people of Australia is debated with ferocity, and we see individuals like the Minister in charge of Education, Christopher Pyne, suggesting that the kind of things taught about what happened when Australia was colonised is somehow not only un-Australian, but is the wrong sort of history to teach because we're not celebrating the civilization that was at the heart of the European project. The fact is, all history is deeply political, and that doesn't just apply to the history of the colonisation of the Australian colonies or elsewhere. It also applies to the history of minds and madness and the way that mental illness has been treated over the years. In what follows, I'm going to take a look at a number of ways that people have thought about the history of minds and madness. I'm going to start off with an exploration of what is called the Whig perspective. And then from there, I shall be moving on to looking at the various rejections that have been made of the Whig perspective before ending up having a slightly more detailed look at Edward Shorter, who we visited in the last lecture. But first, I'd like to share with you some of the poetry of Donald Rumsfeld, the man who was Defense Secretary in George W. Bush Jr.'s government. Here he is talking about the problems of understanding the terrorists and the enemies of the USA.
There are reports that there is no evidence of a direct link between Baghdad and some of these terrorist organizations.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
I'm not.
Several unknowns, and I'm just wondering if this is an unknown
I'm not going to
unknown.
say which it is.
It is the nature of history that we're often dealing with unknown unknowns. Rumsfeld revealed himself to be quite the epistemologist here. Unknown unknowns did not, however, seem to be a problem for Whig historians, who are the subject of the next section. Obviously, this is a Whig, but it's not the kind of Whig that I'm going to be talking about. This Whig is WIG. The Whig that I want to discuss is WHIG. What's the difference? I think it can be very instructive to go to the Oxford English Dictionary, which we can get online through the library. Don't let anyone tell you different. This is a wonderful resource because it gives us a really clear idea of where words come from and when they first get used. There's all sorts of entries here for Whig. Let's have a look at the first one just to see whether this is the Whig we're after. Variously applied to A, sour milk or cream, B, whey, C, buttermilk, D, a beverage consisting of whey fermented and flavoured with herbs. No, I don't think so. So let's go back. Whig. Well, it's got a capital. That's probably a good thing. Let me see. A yokel. A country bumpkin. Obs rare means it's obsolete. Let's go down. An adherent of the Presbyterian cause in Scotland in the 17th century. It's political, but I don't think it's going to do the business for us. Some kind of period applied to the exclusionists who opposed the succession of James, Duke of York, to the crown. You know, we're edging closer and closer to the definition here. A rebel? Nah, it's not that. Hence, from 1689, an adherent of one of the two great parliamentary and political parties in England, and at length in Great Britain, and this to be opposed to the Tories. That just about gets us as close as we can from the political point of view. what we need to get a sense of is that the Whigs themselves, as politicians, had a great deal of faith in the progress of the nation, particularly under their programme. This idea of progress underwrites Whig history. For Whig history, by its very nature, is looking to see how we got to our current state of perfection from the imperfect state of the past. Its focus is merely upon the steps that it has taken to get to that state of perfection, ignoring the messiness in between. Whig history is about the progress of spirit, the progress of ideas, and most of all, the wonderful system of parliamentary democracy that outshone every other political system. More generally, as it's applied to history, it refers to any form of interpretation that has the notion of progress at its heart. And as we'll see, this was, for the best part of 100 years, the dominant way of interpreting minds and madness. And here, once we look at the phrases, we find Whig historian in all its glory, a historian who interprets history as the continuing and inevitable victory of progress over reaction. All professions need their foundational myths, and psychiatry was not alone in this. This historical painting depicts the place that in modern psychiatry's imagination was the birthplace of its methods and practices. Here we see Pinel freeing the insane, an event that was alleged to have taken place in 1795 when the physician Philippe Pinel had been appointed as the medical superintendent of the Salpêtrière hospital. The legend goes that when Pinel arrived at the Salpêtrière, a hospital dedicated to treating mentally ill women, he saw their appalling conditions. He saw them chained up, as we can see the women on this side, and he ordered that their chains be struck off and that they be freed. This depicts what is believed to have been the birth of moral therapy, a therapy that was predicated on the idea that you could use psychological means to cure people with severe mental illness. But not only that, those means should be deployed in an atmosphere of kindness, an atmosphere removed from barbarity. And Pinel was perceived to have been the individual above all others who ushered in this new era. Now, of course, this is a load of old tosh, as they say, back in the home country. It's all a myth. Pinel probably didn't strike the chains from the insane at the Salpêtrière until at least 1797, and it seems he may not have done this right across the board. Nevertheless, this is an iconic image in the Whig history of psychiatry. Now, if I was to characterise the Whig history of psychiatry, it would be about progression from this situation. Here we see depicted William Norris, who during the early part of the 19th century was allegedly kept chained in the Bedlam hospital for 15 years. Norris, treated as a beast, as a wild animal, denied the most basic of human rights. This was a traditional image of the way that psychiatry approached the treatment of the insane during the 18th century. Compare with the balls that were instituted in the asylums during the 1830s and 1840s. That process where the people that were inmates in the asylum were treated as human beings, allowed to eat at table with knives and forks, given entertainments. This is a movement that is characteristic of the Enlightenment, from barbarity to humanity, underpinned by enlightened science. And I think that this is probably best summarised by the celebrated psychiatrist Aubrey Julian Lewis, born and brought up in Adelaide but spent most of his life practising in Britain, including at Bedlam's successor, the Maudsley. And here he is, reviewing Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, and doing so in a rather extraordinary way. After the tortures and judicial murders of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which confounded demoniacal possession with delusion and frenzy, and smelt out witchcraft in the maunderings of demented old women, there were the cruelties and degradation of the madhouses of the 17th and 18th centuries, in which authority used chains and whips as its instruments. Humanitarian effort put an end to the abuses. Pinel in France, Chirurgi in Italy, Tuke in England, inaugurated an era of kindness and medical care which prepared the way for a rational, humane approach to the mastery of mental illness. This, in one paragraph, epitomizes a Whig interpretation of the history of treating minds of madness. You'll still find a lot of people, particularly in psychiatry, that fully accept this interpretation. Practitioners who are fundamentally Whiggish in their approach to their history and their culture. Nevertheless, from the late 50s and early 1960s, this particular view became increasingly under attack from a number of different sources. Later on, I'm going to look at the way the social studies of science, the sociology of knowledge, developed the model of social constructionism that questioned how all scientific knowledge was produced. However, before that, I'd like to take a look at the ideas of Michel Foucault, because love him or loathe him, he is an incredibly important thinker when we're considering these different areas.